Oh, we're ready to go. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you had a wonderful tea break. There was certainly some fantastic food and coffee, tea available. My name's Grant Walton. I'm an associate professor with the Development Policy Centre, and I'm very excited to be chairing this session. Yesterday, I was walking about in Suva. It was raining down and I needed somewhere to go to keep dry. And I spotted the Suva City Carnegie Library, and I thought I'll just rush in and have some shelter from the rain. I went in, and it's a wonderful old building built in 1904, little kind of part of Suva's heritage. And I ascended the stairs on the left-hand side, as I'm sure that many of you can attest. It's a really nice space to go and just chill out, read a book. So I went up the stairs, these old hardwood stairs, up to the left to the reference room, where there's this great Pacific archive. And I started reading some of the books there, and I came across a book on Melanesian history that was from the second Waigani series that was held in Port Moresby from the 30th of June to the 5th of, from the 30th of May to the 5th of June in 1968. And I was flicking through this old book, and it was talking about the history of Melanesia and also the broader Pacific. As I was reading through, I was noticing the language. The language always referred to him, his, he. And I just was reading this book and just thinking about how far things have come in terms of how we research, how we understand issues around gender in particular. But as the keynote speaker, Professor Prasad, reminded us this morning, there's still a very, very long way to go. And I think the statistic was that in Fiji here, 60% of Fijian women experience some sort of violence in their lifetime. So this is an incredibly important session that we're going to have today, looking at gender and violence in the Pacific. So we've got three excellent speakers here with us today, and what we're going to do is have them each present on their topics. They're coming from different disciplinary perspectives. They're having a look at the broader Pacific as well as individual case studies, and they're going to delve deeper into this, into the issues of gender and family violence. So we'll have the presentations first. Each will go for around about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have the presenters come up the front and answer your questions. So please write them down as you come across them. Okay, so first of all, we have Dr. Jessica Collins, who's a research fellow in the Pacific Islands program at the Lowy Institute, and she's currently looking at the Pacific Aid Map project, and she's focusing in particular on Pacific women's development. And prior to joining the Institute, Jessica completed a PhD in anthropology. She's also got a Master's of Global Development and a wealth of experience. So if you could please join me in welcoming Jessica, who's going to be talking about the Pacific Aid Map 28 to 2020.
Thanks, Grant. And gee, I wish I could start off with a story like that. Instead, I've got a story about data sets and Excel tables. So I do hope that you'll stay with me. It's definitely not going to be as interesting. Well, let's try and make it. So yes, so I'm Jess Collins, and for the past 6 months, I've been working on a Pacific Aid Map project, and I have been looking at the gender equality financing trends in the Pacific between 2008 and 2020. And so today I'm just going to talk a little bit about the project and why we're doing it, and talk you through the methodology that we devised. And I'll give you a preview of our results, and I will highlight or underscore here that our results are still early. We're still going through the verification process with donors, but here's the story that we have to tell so far today. And then I'll talk through a few of the recommendations that we have and what's going to come next. So if you've been to this conference before, you may have seen the famous Alexander Dion do his tap dance up here about the Pacific Aid map. It's a pretty terrific interactive map that they've managed to create. We now have Riley Duke, who's also working on it, my brilliant colleague in the middle there. And the Pacific Aid map has essentially captured all of the donors' activities in the Pacific from 67 donors since 2008, and it is now in the form of an interactive map. It covers 14 Pacific Island Forum member countries and captures the ODA and OOF of all those countries as well, from traditional and non-traditional donors. So we know that non-traditional donors do not report, so there's been a lot of gaps that they've had to fill in there. But what we wanted to do was fill in the gaps on gender financing. We wanted to tell that story of how much of that aid is going towards women's empowerment and gender equality. And we know that the OECD already captures that data, but unfortunately in the Pacific, 25% or a quarter of all the activities and projects that are reported to the OECD have no gender equality assessment. So there's a huge gap there, and we needed to fill that so that we could tell the story of what is actually happening here. I.T.S also collects data. It's a voluntary reporting database, and it also collects data using the same gender equality policy marker system as OECD. So the data between those two is comparable, and we've been able to use all that data too. But, as alongside the broader Pacific Aid Map project, we know that, the donor reporting is often lacks detail and it's difficult to access. So this is the problem that we're trying to address here. And we also know, as I said before, that non-traditional donors do not report at all. So we've got to be able to tell their story for them. And so the purpose of this project has been to create the most comprehensive analysis of gender financing in the Pacific. So we had to expand the Pacific Aid Map database. It was already huge, but we've had to expand it a little bit more, try and add a few more details and use the details that we already have. And we filled in tens of thousands of data gaps on the gender equality objectives of activities in the Pacific. And soon enough, we will be adding a tag to the interactive map so that when you do go on there as a user, you'll be able to find all the gender equality investments right across the region from 2008. So the methods that we used, first we had to define gender equality financing, what it really meant to us and what it really means to donors. We had to expand the database, fill in the gaps, but then we took it off for a process of verification, and the methodology had to be sent off for verification as well as the data. And then we have done preliminary analysis, but we'll also adapt it once we get those verification results come in. So the DAC network on gender equality uses a gender equality policy marker. Now, this is what all the traditional donors use when they're reporting to the OECD. And as I said before, it's also used by I.T.S, and we have taken this in its current form because it's not only endorsed by the 30 DAC members, Development Assistance Committee members that make up GenderNet, but it's also used universally across those systems too. So, if it's not broken, don't fix it. We decided to maintain comparability across all systems. Now, it's a pretty simple system to follow. So we've got a score of 0, 1, and 2. Anything that receives a score of 0 means that gender equality is not targeted at all. There is no objective in there for gender equality and women's empowerment. A score of 1 is where gender equality is an important and deliberate objective. So it's a significant part of the project, but it's not the primary purpose. And they sometimes call this gender mainstreaming as well. And a score 2 is where the primary objective is for gender equality. So the project wouldn't have been done without having this gender equality objective. So donors have already reported on a lot of their activities, not all of them, but a lot of them. This project wasn't to assess the markings that they gave to their projects. It's outside the scope of this, but also they have access to a lot more detail than we do. There have been some markings that have been questionable, but we have taken them at face value because that is the assessment that they gave of their own project. So I'm just giving you a little snippet here of, part of the AidMap database that is available as well, but we've added in a gender column down the end, and you can see there are some E's there, which represent empty. There's also some blank cells as well. Now that these are the projects and activities that we had to fill, obviously not all of them because there are tens of thousands of them, but then there's the low E gender column as well, and that's where we put the tag in where it was appropriate, where we felt that it deserved a score of 1 or a score of 2. And so when we were adding the supplemental data, we had a 5-step process. And so what we did is we took out we filtered out all the projects that already had a tag, and then we worked with the rest of that data set. And we started with looking at all the projects. We filtered out the projects that targeted Sustainable Development Goal 5. So that's gender equality and women's empowerment. And then we filtered out all the projects that targeted the purpose codes of 15170 and 15180, because those two purposes target women's empowerment and gender equality. We then looked at donor agencies, and particularly UN and CEDAW, because their mandate is to target gender equality transformation. We did the same thing with implementing partners. So you can see we've got around 30 here. All of them have women's empowerment at its core objective. And so we looked at those, and then we assessed the projects and the activities according to what we filtered out there. And then the final step was doing a keyword search, and we used these keywords up here, which you can probably easily read. And we primarily did the searches in the descriptions column and then in the project title. So once we'd added all that supplemental data and we'd done the assessments based on the 012 system, we sent off our results to the top 5 donors: Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the Asian Development Bank, and the World Bank. And we sent them also our methodology in full and donor-specific tag data. So all the tag data that we had tagged so that we could get their verification, but also the ones that we had left blank and they had also left blank themselves. So I'll say again, these results are preliminary, but this is a story that we've managed to get from the analysis that we've done so far. So we found $222 million of new significant gender projects. So this is projects where gender equality has been mainstreamed into them. $220 million of new projects added by Lowy Institute researchers, and 1/3 of those went to Australia and 2/3 went to the World Bank. Now, most of those added Gender 1 projects were related to the Pacific Police Development Program. We also found $222,000 worth for China. China's activities in the Pacific had gender equality mainstreamed into them. In terms of principal projects, we only found $19 million worth of new principal projects, and 38% of that was from Australia and 43% from the UN. We had $198,000 from China and $354,000 worth of principal gender projects from Taiwan. Now, many of Australia's untagged projects related to the ANC partnership agreements, and what happened with these projects is that they all had exactly the same project description. So there was nothing identifying about it. It was just the project description was about the ANCP partnership agreement. So what we had to do was look at the implementing partners and use that as a differential factor. So, for example, if they had Plan International as the implementing partner, well, then that project is highly likely to have gender equality as an objective, because Plan International is solely about empowering women and advancing women's equality. Okay, so this is a line graph showing the total gender financing between 2008 and 2020 from all donors. And you can see, good news story, that it is trending upwards. There's quite a spike in 2018 from a big project from the World Bank that was giving a loan to Papua New Guinea, and that was to strengthen fiscal management. There was also a slight decrease between 2018 and 2019, and then a huge spike in 2020. Now, that big spike in 2020 came from the Asian Development Bank, a $2 billion project that was given to Fiji, and that was a COVID related support package. And what we can see is over the past few years, there have been changes in the way that donors have been reporting, and we've seen, with the, let's take, for example, the ADB $2 billion loan or $2 billion package to Fiji. We found that this was marked as 2, so it was a principal project, designated as a principal project. But we only found, doing further investigation into the documents, that gender responsive budgeting was mainstreamed into it. So, one of the stories that we can tell from this research that we're doing is that the way that donors report really affects the trends that come out of it. And that's really important for policymakers who are trying to make better informed decisions and evidence-based decisions, that the way that donors report can really impact on that process. Okay, so the blue bar chart here is a cumulative gender finance in the Pacific. You can see from between 2008 and 2020, Australia completely overshadows the rest of the donors. Now, that's in line with its overall aid budget to the Pacific. It's always been the largest donor to the Pacific. ADB has significantly caught up, and that was because of the 2020 $2 billion project. But you can see that China and Taiwan are negligible. New Zealand's is commensurate with its size of economy as well. But if we look over to just 2020 in the red chart, you can see, ADB's results are huge for that year. And you can see that if that really is a principal project, that it really does change the trends and the way that we view Pacific financing in the Pacific. Okay, so this graph shows you the donors in proportion to each other, in relation to each other. And Australia had the biggest proportion starting out in 2008 and has been slowly trending downwards as the other donors have been increasing. 2018, there's that spike from the World Bank bringing down Australia's results, and then the same again in 2020. And, given the potential of the inflation of results here, I think it's really important to stress the value of comprehensive and clear reporting from donors. So if we zoom in on Australia, given it's the biggest donor to the Pacific, we can see the trend since 2008 for their gender equality financing, the total financing. And there was a spike with the change in government in 2011 and 2012, Gillard government, but Gillard government. And we also had the start of Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Development. And that has been trending downwards. Pacific Women Shaping Pacific Women's Development also stopped being funded in July 2019. But we also know that the aid budget overall has been declining through those years as well, so it's commensurate with that. And this is a graph to show how much of Australia's overall aid budget to the Pacific goes to mainstream gender and to significant. And we can see that the principle is pretty consistent. So it's ranged between about 7% and 4%. The global average is currently 4%, and in 2020 it ended up 6%. So we're doing slightly better than the global average. But the mainstream gender could do a lot better. So the average is 44% across the globe. And we can see that, it nearly reached that in 2012, 2013. And, I think there's room to move with that. So the recommendation. Well, I think it's pretty clear that the first recommendation must be that donor reporting must be complete. We must have all donors that are reporting to the OECD report on their gender equality financing, because when we do that, when we have clearer data, then policymakers can make more informed decisions. And, we heard before about the connection between women and development, and it starts with better data, so we know where the money needs to go. Donor reporting, when it is done, must be accurate and justified. So if we have things like port upgrades, which has happened, port upgrades and loans for airports that have been tagged as having gender equality investments in them, then, those must be justified. And there is space to do that in the project descriptions, that you can justify the issues that have been addressed there. And administrative costs shouldn't be tagged for having gender equality investment. The descriptions can also have cross-cutting issues in them. So, it's not just going to be about gender equality mostly. if we can have more information in there, then it's better for the public and we can have better accessibility as well. The in-house gender marking should be standardized to the universal system. So thankfully, a lot of the big donors, the major donors in the Pacific do use the 012 system, but it's just a matter of being able to transport that across into the OECD so that we can all access that. The OECD should also consider using a percentage grading system when it comes to the significant and gender mainstreamed data. So what we've seen is that quite a few projects that have been marked as having significant gender transformation objectives might just have a little bit in there, whereas others have quite a lot in it. And I don't think that's fair across the system. So whilst we can maintain the 012 system so that data remains comparable, it would be preferable for significant projects to be to have a sort of percentage number on it as well, so that we can better understand how much is really going into this. And finally, that the OECD considers to provide an incentive to mark on their gender equality assessment by tagging all blank entries as 0. A little bit harsh, but it might work. So the next steps, we're going to respond to the verification process and the reviews from the donors and adjust the results accordingly and see if we can tell a better story than what we've been able to get from the OECD and what we've been able to tag ourselves. And then we'll update the database and hopefully get those tags on the AMAP pretty soon. And then, end of June, we'll be launching the results. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions after this, and our contact details are up here if you do have any questions over the coming weeks. Thank you.
Oh, what a great presentation. Thank you very much, Jessica, for that. I'm now far more informed about what's happening in terms of the donor response in the region. But what we're going to do now is we're going to shift our thinking. We've been thinking regional. We've been thinking about the response from donors. We're now going to focus on Samoa. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Now, our next speaker, Dia Pritad Rajiti, is currently a PhD student at the Art Gordon Department of Economics at the Australian National University. She's interested in a range of topics related to international development and economics. And she's formerly an analyst at the Executive Office of the President of the Republic of Indonesia, where she was involved in the preparation of several strategic government projects. She has a Master's of Philosophy in Economics at the University of Cambridge, as well as a Master's in Economics for Development at Oxford. So with those fantastic credentials and her topic today, focusing on family size and domestic violence in a highly fertile society in Samoa, I'm sure this is going to be a great presentation. Put your hands together for Dia, please.
Thank you so much, Karen, for the introduction. So today I'm going to Thank you so much. So today I'll share one of my PhD chapter examining the effect of family size on domestic violence, especially in high fertility society, and I use case study of Samoa. So this study is actually part of the Pacific Development Research Partnership project that was funded by the Asian Development Bank Institute, as well as the ANU Development Policy Center. So the motivation of this study is actually rooted in the long-standing question on how family size affects household socioeconomic condition. So while previous studies have largely focused on how family size affect children's health condition as well as educational attainment, here in this case, I aim to expand the discussion by examining the impact on domestic violence against women in a high fertility society by drawing case study from Samoa. And as we know already that domestic violence is a significant problem that remains prevalent and also underreported in many developing countries, including the Pacific region. And the negative effect of domestic violence, I think, yeah, we know already, to the victims, to the families, and to the communities, as well as the strain that it puts on, for example, the healthcare system, the social justice system, and also the social services, etc. And I think this all study have been well documented. However, there remains a significant gap, especially to understand sort of the causal factors that contribute to the prevalence of domestic violence. And one area that still receives little understanding is how actually family size affect the prevalence of domestic violence. And here I'm showing you sort of like the context in Samoa, how fertility and domestic violence looks like. So in figure 1 here on your left, you can see Samoa actually stood out in terms of total fertility rates in 2021, which is 4 births per woman, which is higher from the global average of 2.3 and also higher from the average of the Pacific Island states for 3.3. And this condition potentially was contributed by the prevalence of child marriage, where girls marry at a young age. And in fact, in Samoa, 1 in 5 women who are at age 20, they at least have given birth to at least 1 child. And also the another factor that could contribute to this high total fertility rate is the low adoption and also utilization of contraceptive method. And actually in Pacific region, the adoption rate is around 20 to 30%, which is way lower from the Asia Pacific region average of 60%. And in terms of domestic violence, the figure on your right, figure 2, you can see that in Samoa, there are 38% of women reported to have experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetime, which is higher than the global average of around 25%. And then next, here I'm showing you sort of a simple cross-country plot that correlates, sort of like showing correlation between total fertility rate and then the share of women who experience intimate partner violence. You can see that in the figure on your left, it shows a positive correlation between the 2 variables, which is consistent in the year 2007 and 2017. And then the figure on your right, figure 4, here it's actually pretty encouraging that the change in the total fertility rate, there is a reduction within these 10 years in the total fertility rate, is accompanied by the reduction of women who are experiencing intimate partner violence. So this could potentially indicate that total fertility rate could contribute to the reduction of total fertility rate could contribute to the reduction of intimate partner violence. And so I've shown you the sort of motivation context, and then next I'll take you to delve deeper into like how I establish sort of the framework, how I connect between the two, fertility and also domestic violence. And also I will also explain to you in terms of how I identify the causal effect to isolate the effect of fertility on domestic violence. And then I provide the results, including various effect heterogeneity across subgroups, subsamples. And lastly, I'll provide the conclusion. So then how actually fertility can be related to intimate partner violence? So the theory from like 1981 from the resource dilution theory actually can land the framework, although it's mostly used to explain the trade-off, the sort of the quantity quality trade-off of children, but it actually can lend its framework to explain the complex relationship between fertility and also domestic violence. So this theory posits that as family size increases, the available resources for both parents and children, for example, finances, time, and attention, become increasingly scarce. And this scarcity will potentially exacerbate the family stressors, for example, financial difficulties, marital conflicts, and parenting challenges, which then lead to increased family tension and conflicts, which in turn can escalate domestic violence. And so this increase in the number of children in the family can also create significant challenge for victims who are attempting to leave an abusive relationship, as the abused spouse could potentially also use children as a means of control, which then can also perpetuate the cycle of violence that harm the entire family. And to examine the impact of fertility on domestic violence, I use the data of Samoa from the I.T.S. 2019 to 2020, which is the last round of the I.T.S data. So this, as I mentioned before, that this paper will focus on domestic violence against women that is inflicted by their spouse or partner, or usually termed as intimate partner violence. And this I.T.S survey, the survey selected one eligible woman per household sample. So these women are those who are aged 15 to 49, who is or has been married, or who is or has been living with a man in an intimate relationship. So as the total sample here, there's around 1,500 women who were interviewed for the spousal violence questionnaire, and this yield a response rate of 100% among these women. And here are the sort of the outcome variables of interest related to the intimate partner violence. So we look at emotional violence, physical violence, sexual violence. So I think in the survey, they provide an extensive sort of variables that construct this type of violence. And I construct dummy variable for each. And also in the survey, they also collect information about the attitudes toward domestic violence. So this is, they collect information about the views of the women on domestic violence, whether they justify acts of abuse that was perpetrated by their partner. And the empirical approach here, so perhaps like in the economy, like when we look at when we try to establish a causal impact, we have to be very careful, especially in terms of the potential endogeneity from the variable that we are interested to look at here in this case is fertility, because they're potentially reverse causality and also object variable bias. So here, to isolate sort of the exogenous factor of fertility, I use 3 distinct and plausibly exogenous instruments for ideal fertility. So here are the 3 instruments. One is the same-sex sibling pairs in family with 2 or more children, and then whether the family have a twin, and then a female firstborn. And the regression, I use the standard IV regression using 2 state least squares. And we have in the 2 state least squares, the first state is that we regress the sort of the fertility estimated on the instruments. And then on the second stage, we have the outcome variable regressed on the predicted fertility. And this is like some explanations on sort of like for the instruments to be valid, we should satisfy 2 important conditions. One is that the instruments should have strong relevance. So here that these same-sex sibling pairs, twin and female firstborn, should be able to explain the variation of the number of children in the family. And also it should not affect the outcome variable except through the endogenous variable. So same-sex sibling pairs argued to be a good instrument because the occurrence of same-sex sibling pairs is potentially random or by chance, since that parents are significantly more likely to have another child if the first two children are of the same sex due to their preference of a mixed sibling sex composition. Similarly to twin, it's an exogenous variation of family size because it's unlikely to depend on family background. And also female firstborn is also potentially a good instrument, especially when the society has a preference over sons than daughter. So if the first child is not a son, and the parents would prefer to have at least one son, they're more likely to attempt to have another child. And there are potentially other omitted variable bias, and I control that in part, including other control variables such as age, education level, underage marriage, marital status, homogamous education. So homogamous education is that whether the victim or the women have the same education as of the partner, and also household wealth index quantile. So here I show you the correlation between the instrument variable and the endogenous variable, which is the number of children who are equal or less than 17 years old. And it shows more like a stylized correlation. It shows that all the variables have high relevance. And formally, I also did a standard first states of the IV to SLS, and it also shows a high relevance. All the three, so column 1 and 6, I do it independently. Then in column 7 and 8, I do it all together simultaneously, and it all still show strong correlation. And then we can also see the F statistics, which is very important for instrument variable analysis, that the F statistic is also well above 30. So in general, this is a sort of like a good instruments to be used, and we can use that in the next analysis. And on top of that, I also examine looking at the first states heterogeneity. So just in case from the previous first states that I just showed you, I just also examine based on the subsample, looking at whether the first states actually varied or not. And we can see that the point estimate is actually pretty consistent across subsample, and which gives support to the instrument relevance. So this is the main result. So we can see that, so this is after the two-stage least square. So the dependent variable is so in panel A is whether they experience any intimate partner violence, so either emotional, physical, or sexual during a lifetime. And in panel B is in the last 12 months. And we can see that number of children here who are at the age of 17 or less than 17. So when we use all three instruments, it gives significant positive and significant results, either when we're controlling for the covariates or not. So around 5 percentage point increase in experience of intimate partner violence for every additional child. So this, if we put it into perspective, it's around 13% increase from the mean value for having another. So for having another child, it increased the prevalence by 13%. So, and the results is also similar when we use same-sex siblings in terms of the point estimate. Although when we look at twin and female first child, there is no significant effect. I mean, there's no stars there, but I mean, this probably because of the local average treatment effect. But we decided to use all the three instruments because I think every instrument deal with different exogenous factor. And on top of that, aside from looking at the intimate partner violence, I also look at different other outcomes. So here, the independent variable is still the same, fertility or the number of children. And I look at the outcome here, like whether the women become more afraid of the spouse, and also whether they experience serious injury, whether they are more likely to seek help. But unfortunately here, it doesn't seem that having more child lead to positive outcome in there. But then interestingly here in the sort of like column 4, the first row, having more child actually lead to a higher attitude of women justifying domestic violence by 3.8 percentage points. So this is very interesting that having more child actually normalize domestic violence in the family. And then also having more child leading to lower female labor force participation by 4.2 percentage point. So this is here in the second row. But then I also look at other mediating factor related to egalitarian decision making or coercive control, and whether the spouse are more likely to be drunk, and apparently there is no effect of additional child on these outcomes. And aside from that, I also look at the violence not only for women but also on the child. So because usually there is sort of like a spillover effect when, I mean, they're more likely violence in the home with on the wife, but then I think that potentially that they're more likely also violence towards the child. And we can see that additional children here also lead to higher likelihood of physical punishment by around 2.7 percentage point, and also any violent discipline towards children. And also similarly, they also increase justice among the caretaker. It increased their attitude towards justifying child abuse by 2.5 percentage point. And I also provide effect heterogeneity here, means that I disaggregate the sample by subsamples according to demographic characteristics. So I look at whether they have children less than 5 years old and etc. So here in the first row, we can see that when they have children more than 0 means that so the previous sample actually include those who have no children, but here I restrict the sample to be those who have children, and the effect is slightly larger to be 5.5 percentage point. And when we examine the effect among family or women who have less than 5 years old children, the effect becomes double to be 10.5 percentage points. So if you already have young children in the home and then you have another child, so this would lead to higher propensity of domestic violence by 10.5 percentage points. And also I also estimate by sort of household characteristics in terms of income. And there is no significant effect, but the point estimate is still the same. So this actually led to the argument that the resource dilution theory actually consistent across income distribution. So it doesn't depend on the sort of their endowment, their previous resource that they have. So even in the rich household, the resource dilution theory also happening, that additional children also can lead to higher propensity of domestic violence. Yeah. And this is pretty interesting that I also did a further heterogeneity, looking at how the dynamics within the household, looking at the effect of extended family and also other adults who live in the household. Yeah, so usually like when you, I mean, in a lot of Pacific regions, like household, they have a lot of household, including extended families, and I try to see whether having another families as part of the household leading to higher domestic violence. And apparently those female who live with in-laws lead to higher domestic violence, around 6.1 percentage point. Similarly here, live with other adult in-laws, also 6.4 percentage points. So as per the conclusion, so we can see based on the I.T.S as a regression, there's a 5 percentage point increase in domestic violence, and equivalent to 13% increase from the mean value. And the estimate of the IV is actually larger than the OLS. So, so the standard OLS indicate an underestimation of the true effect. And Most of the significant effect of the IPV is driven by physical and sexual form of abuse. And larger family also tend to have attitudes that condone violent behavior. This perhaps due to the normalization in the violent behavior that leads to lack of resources available for them to effectively address and resolve conflict. So they're more accepting of this violent behavior, and having more children in a family also linked to women who are less likely to be in the labor force, around 15% reduction from the average value. And so in terms of the policy perspective here, so there should be a greater awareness of the potential victimization risks for larger families and the importance of the integrated family planning and domestic violence prevention efforts. So, thank you, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Daya. Some really interesting results there looking at Samoa. So I'm looking forward to some comments coming from all of you. And just as a reminder, write down your questions that you might have for our presenters today. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next presentation, and I'm equally happy to be introducing our next presenter. Our next presenter, Akata Taito from the United Nations Capital Development Fund. She is the chairperson of financial inclusion for the Data Working Group, or was the chairperson, I should say, and has had various roles at the Reserve Bank of Fiji for over 10 years, including as a senior analyst. She's a Masters of Commerce and Economics from right here in the University of South Pacific. So if you can put your hands together and welcome her to the stage. Welcome, mate.
Thank you, Grant. Good morning to everyone. So we've had two amazing presentations, where the funds are going in terms of donor, and then we've had amazing results in terms of the gender violence in Samoa. And now I will talk to you about the actual implementation that we're doing with gender mainstreaming in our programming. Specifically on my presentation, I will be looking at how digital financial services are empowering and building the resilience of women and the socially excluded against climate change. And my focus on digital services will be specifically on financial digital services. So just to provide you with let me go back. I am from the Pacific Insurance and Climate Adaptation Program. This is a program that's been implemented by the United Nations Capital Development Fund as the lead agency. We also have administrative support from the more familiar UNDP, and we receive technical support from our UN university based in Bonn. Our program receives funding from Australia and New Zealand, and I see a trend with our first presenter, but we also receive a specific funding from India UN Development Partnership Fund and the government of Luxembourg for Fiji specific projects. Just to provide you with an overview of my presentation, when we're talking about gender, I will be highlighting some of the development challenges and why we focus on gender in particular, why women's digital financial services or financial inclusion matter in the Pacific, and our approach as a program and UNCDF in terms of mainstreaming gender into our overall programming with tangible solutions. And I will end my presentation with some of the testimonies of the uptake that we're seeing in the community. So it's not new information that natural hazards frequenting the Pacific with increased intensity. And I can say that in the Pacific, we are all resilient people. But when we see the frequency and intensity of these events increasing, it wears out that traditional resilience. And so we have to come up with innovative solutions and how we can continue to empower, particularly our vulnerable communities to build their own self-resilience. And we know that with this frequency of natural hazards, women and socially excluded are disproportionately affected. They're already facing higher risk, and they are also burdened further by the climate events. And we know that in the Pacific, there is also the deep-rooted gender equality, but these gender issues are not unique. It's also following through to our socially excluded groups, the low-income groups, those in the rural and maritime. So how can we ensure that we are building resilience of these vulnerable groups? We also see that women are also further challenged by their lack of access to resources, financial for that matter. So that's where our program comes in. Why do women's financial inclusion matter? As I had mentioned, when we see that women are included in the overall programming, in the overall decision making, ensuring that they have access to financial services, it empowers them to make their own financial decisions. When they're included in the financial services and that they have equal access to these opportunities, they are able to build their own self-resilience. They are an untapped market, women, vulnerable groups. So we need to push the private sector or nudge them to provide services to these segments. And when that happens, we are not only contributing to the achievement of the sustainable development groups, but we are also reducing poverty. We are giving them the autonomy to make their own decision, to use their own finances, and overall building their self-resilience. So as a program, our overall objective is to improve the financial preparedness of Pacific Islanders towards climate change and natural hazards. We work towards a market-based solution. We believe in user pay principle, and just to stress, we do not offer financial services, but we help build the ecosystem and make sure that we have a strong foundation for sustainable financial services being offered in each of the Pacific markets. We started our work here in Fiji, in Fiji and Vanuatu and Tonga in 2021 and 2022. And from this year onwards, we're looking at other Pacific countries, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Kiribati, Timor-Leste, and RMI. So this is how our overall program works. We build local capacities. We work with government agencies in the Pacific. So in Fiji, we work closely with the Ministry of Finance, with the Reserve Bank of Fiji. We also work with other central banks in the region, being our anchor partners. And given that our solution that we are trying to develop with the private sector is a financial solution, a climate and disaster risk financial instrument, particularly parametric insurance, we work with local insurance providers. And given that financial services providers are under the ambit of various central banks, we also work with central banks to ensure that whatever we're offering in the market is within the regulatory framework. We also develop, help build capacity for the private sector in terms of the local insurance companies. As we know, in the Pacific, the insurance uptake is relatively low, and these are mostly conventional type of financial services, which are often taken up by high income groups. And so vulnerable, low income, MSMEs, and women are often excluded from traditional type of financial services. So we help to develop local capacities, the private sector in particular, to ensure that they are offering this kind of services to market segments that they perhaps would have never targeted. And when we talk about insurance and climate change, a lot of the reinsurance companies are not willing to tap into that sector. And so what we do is that we connect the local insurance companies with global reinsurance who have a larger pot and are able to offer this kind of services to the Pacific. We also connect our local insurance companies with risk modelers. As I mentioned, climate change is relatively new in the Pacific when we talk about financial services and risk modeling. And so there's limited capacity within the current private sector to offer this type of innovative solutions. So we connect them to global risk modelers to help them build their internal capacity. So we've seen over time that with parametric insurance, now the insurance companies are trying to bundle that with traditional type of services that they have and are offering this in the market. Then we have our data partner. So we work with local Met officers for verifiable data, because when we talk about climate change, we need data on wind speed, on rainfall. How are we going to verify the data, and making sure that this information is acceptable by users, but at the same time, trustworthy. And we also have aggregator partners, because the solution that we're trying to develop with the private sector has to be affordable. It has to be convenient. So how can we pool a larger group and ensure that they are able to access these services? So we work with pharma agencies, with cooperatives, and ensure that the services are easily accessible and available to them. We know that with cooperatives and pharma agencies, they already have members that they have established a financial and a non-financial relationship with. So there's trust within that circle. And so they're able to go out into the communities. Not only do they inform them, do they create awareness around solutions that are available to them, so that they are able to build their own resilience, but also if they're interested, their members are then onboarded through the agri agencies. We also understand that whilst we try to develop a market-based solution, there will always be a segment in the community that may not be able to afford this type of services. So we work with government agencies such as the Department of Social Welfare in Fiji, so that those that are under social welfare recipients are able to access these solutions, and that government are transferring that risk to the private sector. We also have, under our One UN banner, a lot of agencies that look at women's disaster resilience and social protection, such as WFP, UN Women. So how can we bring these agencies together, mobilize resources to effectively reach scale? And we also work with digital payment providers as a distribution channel. In Fiji, we know that the uptake of mobile financial services is relatively high. We're looking at around 70 to 80% of the adult population having actively been using mobile wallets. So we leverage off that digital platform. We know that government have also been using these digital services to reach out to communities following a disaster. And we know that it's often the mobile network that normally the first to be restored following a disaster. So how can we ensure that if there's a trigger event, these end users are able to access that fund relatively quickly? Not only do we try to look at the overall solution, but how can we work with fintech firms? So throughout the overall process, we worked with a fintech firm to develop our iOnboard platform, a digital iOnboard platform that allows for onboarding of customers into this insurance solution. So this platform is also linked to the private sector, the insurance companies' core systems, so that customers are able to be onboarded remotely with lower eKYC requirements. They do not have to travel to main branches to be subscribed to this parametric product. And we also work with, as I had mentioned, digital payment channels to ensure that they're able to pay their premium, but as well as if there's a trigger event, receive payments directly into their mobile wallets. And it also gives women the autonomy to use, to have that decision to use the funds that they receive, because these funds goes directly into their account. Throughout our program, we also launched a gender equality and social inclusion strategy. And this is for us to ensure that all our programming consider gender and socially excluded, and that no one is left behind in the digital era. So these are the products that we worked with insurance companies, with the general public to develop. These are not solutions that are parachuted into each of the countries. These solutions are developed based on demand studies, on supply side diagnostic studies, on discussions that we had with the insurance companies, with regulators, but as well as risk modelers looking at 43 years of historical data. So in Fiji, this is the product that's available in Fiji. The products were launched in 2021. And during the pilot phase, we had an uptake of around 1,388. And unfortunately, fortunately for the people of Fiji, there wasn't a trigger event, but then we weren't able to fully test the capacity of this solution. So following the pilot phase, we went back to end users, we did our various assessments, and enhancements were made to the initial product. And so we added rainfall cover because we know that flooding in Fiji is quite common. And so this year we saw a total uptake in Fiji of 4,147, including the pilot that's currently underway in Tonga and Vanuatu. We have a total of 4,799, of which 47% are women. And we also have a significant number coming through from persons with disability. We also have a lower tiered product with the Department of Social Welfare with the lower sum insured of $400. Note that these products are offered by the insurance companies. Multiple payouts are allowable, and the cost is 10% of each of the total cover. So in Vanuatu, you would remember earlier this year, in March, there were twin cyclones. We had a total uptake at the time of the cyclone of 122. We tried to keep the pilot phase to a smaller sample because we are still testing it in the market. So out of the 122, around more than 80% received a payout because of the twin cyclones, Kevin and Judy. And the payouts in total amounted to around 2.8 million baht. And these funds went directly into the policyholders. In Fiji, there were 2 trigger events based on the revised product. Earlier this year, we had excessive rainfall, particularly in the Western Division. One in January and again in February. As you can see, the total payout in total came to around 200,000 Fijian dollars. And we had significant numbers of beneficiaries who are women as well as persons living with disability. And again, around 87% in the first payout, 73% in the second payout went directly into individual mobile wallets, and the remainder went to the bank account. So all the payments goes through digital platforms. Following the payout, we went back to the communities and we wanted to see what's the feedback like based on those that received the payout. So I'll show you a brief video on testimonies from the ground.
Smallholder farmers in the Western Division. Smallholder farmers in the Western Division who signed up for the Climate Care Parametric Micro Insurance Policy received their payout following the recent rainy weather. The beneficiaries believe that while the recent adverse weather conditions is something that they cannot control, investing in an insurance policy was a step in the right direction.
In this area, Naviango area is the low-lying area, flooding area, and we have to, many times the flood comes here, damages our cane here.
The river, the water from the river and water from the gates and damages all the crops. vegetable. It's not only my farm, but there's so many farmers out there in our community.
It's really helpful. It's already now receiving that money during the rainy season. No, it was just a big help.
I got some money.
I received 250. From that money, I want to tell you something. I happy with my business. My business is Alice running enterprise. I do so many business so that I can survive. Likewise, those money, I break it down. I deposit the $50 in my business account. $50 for my food for that month. And you can see so many buckets here, from here to there. And I sold so many flowers. And I know that I can survive. Staying here, I can survive with this flower. I'm so glad that I can manage to move on.
Yes, I signed up and paid the premium.
I would be very much looking forward to that, renewing every year, and I advise all farmers and all these small businesses out there to take interest in this initiative. Yes.
So for women, we see that they are being empowered and that this small injections helps with their business continuity. They're not relying on government or other family members to get back on their feet. It may be small injections, but it helps them to get back on their feet while waiting on other support systems to come in. These are some of the other feedback that we have received. And what we have seen throughout the implementation phase of our program is that these institutions, the private sector, government agencies, the regulatory bodies, we are still providing the support that is needed to ensure that as we pull away, these services continue to be offered in the market and done so in a sustainable way. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to now hand it over to you. It's your chance to ask questions to our presenters. So do we have anybody in the crowd that would like to ask a question? Oh, yes. Down in front. Anybody else?
My name is Penelope Schofel. I'm with the National University of Samoa, and I've worked as a gender consultant for the last 30 years. So it's very interesting, really interesting data. Great papers, thank you very much. I just have a couple of comments. The first one is on the aid map. What I found working as a consultant is there's huge pressure, especially by ADB, to quantify your gender target, right? There has to be an indicator that can be monitored. And so, for example, when they were building a wall for one of the other islands in Vanuatu, the engineers were told, you've got to be gender, well, I mean, obviously this wall was going to benefit women, they could take their things to market, it's great. But no, that wasn't enough. They had to say, well, how many women are going to directly benefit? And so they said, okay, 35% of the labour force will be female. Well, I mean, that's just ridiculous. There's no way that they're going to employ 35% of the women as a labour force to build a wharf, because it's simply not a safe thing for women to do, nor is it culturally acceptable. So, but that still went in. And I can tell you time after time, I wouldn't bore you with long stories about this, but there is this pressure to put in unrealistic gender indicators to make the project look good. So although it's marvelous to see that there is more money going in for women, there is this caveat that I would suggest needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Where's my other comment? Oh, yes. On the Samoan study, it's a really interesting finding. But I would just like to mention that there are, in the last 3-4 years, there have been 5 studies of gender-based violence in Samoa, 5, all going on at the same time. Now, why is this? Is it because Samoa's got more violence against women than anywhere else, or more fertility than anywhere else? I don't think so. I think there are reasons for this. One is that Samoa has 2 major islands with a road around both of them and a ferry that goes between the 2 of them. And so we don't have in Samoa, we don't have any remote outer islands. So it's a great place to do social research and get data. Secondly, we have a really good Samoan Bureau of Statistics. It's really good. You know, they do agricultural surveys. They do the health surveys every couple of years. They do the census. And so you can get really good official data in Samoa. So I think this is what attracts people to come and study gender-based violence in Samoa, rather than in some more difficult countries which don't have such good statistical data. So I think that one needs to think about that. I think Samoa's changed a lot.
We might just ask you just to quickly wrap. So
yeah, I will quickly wrap up.
Thank you.
I would just like to say that there's been a lot of social change in Samoa. So my dear husband, Malama Malaysia, here, is one of 16 children. And I lived with that family for many years, and I never saw anybody being violent to anybody. But I do think that there are things going on in society today that could explain your finding and its significance. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll hand it over to the presenters.
Well, thanks for your question. And look, I agree with you. I would start by saying that we're looking at the financing and not the indicators. And, you know, the gender equality assessment is done on the design of the project, not the evaluations or anything that's coming out of it. So it's not quantified by that. It's just, you know, generally how much money is going into these projects and how much is actually, you know, objectively targeting gender equality. So it's a bit sort of high level than what you're talking about. The other thing that I would add is that the targets that donors have for gender equality can also have a perverse effect of impacting on the reporting. And so, you know, there might be pressures to reach certain targets. You know, 80% of our funding has to have gender equality mainstreamed into it, or whatever the case may be. And then those numbers get inflated. But of course, the problem is that if we don't have accurate and, you know, real numbers going into the data sets, then, you know, as policymakers and as researchers and academics, and, you know, we just don't have a real story to work with. And so, you know, we're starting off on the wrong foot there. So thank you for your question. I do agree with you that, you know, we have to be, you know, we have to be careful about the way that we do report and the pressures that we put on reporters as well.
So thank you for the comments and also the questions. So in terms of why the study has been increasing in Samoa, but I think it's not only in Samoa, but I think also in the other countries in the Pacific region, because there's recently new data available from the I.T.S multiple indicator cluster survey done in Fiji, Vanuatu, Tonga, and also in, you may check on your own, but I think this is a very useful and rich data set that can be used to replicate the study that I've done in Samoa. So potentially for students here, for potential research question that can be used for the other countries available. And in terms of, I mean, you provide anecdotal stories that you stay in a big families with 16 children, but you didn't see any evidence of violence. But I think this is the case of domestic violence where it's underreported, very likely. And actually the results that I show you here, like 5 percentage point increase in prevalence or 13% increase from the mean value is actually in the lower bound because the case of underreporting of domestic violence. So perhaps the actual impact could be much larger than what I said here. Yeah.
Next question, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Dr. Shukla. It's not a big question, just its appreciation, especially for the three presenters. The last one, Kita, she focus towards the real issues, whatever we are facing currently. And as for the first presenter, Jessica, in her recommendations, she focused that how the report should be accurate, it should be compiled. And as he mentioned that this study was 2019, hopefully. And we are awaiting June, end of this month, as soon as we receive the real result, then we can conclude anything. So thank you very much, all team. All the best.
Thanks for that comment. Okay, further questions? This is the lady down the front here. Is there?
I'm curious about your analyze your project level.
Yeah, so it is at project level, but you don't take a deeper dive into it. We've also, the analysis that you saw is actually on spend. So it's on disbursements as well. It's not on commitments. So it gives us a more accurate picture of what is actually happening on the ground, what is being committed, because we know that commitments can often not actually eventuate. And unfortunately, some of the donors like to focus more on the commitments because they do tell a better story. But we have been looking at the spend figures on that.
Good afternoon. I found all the presentation interesting, but I would like to ask a question specifically for the AID lab. My name is Brigitte Lezuk. I'm working with the Pacific Women League program. So first question, why you didn't take into account EU in among the donors? They quite an important donor in the region, especially on gender equality, some specific program. I wanted to know also if you have data disaggregated by country, because most of the investment in the region, whether it's gender equality or whatever else, goes to the Melanesian countries. But in the small island development states, it's quite a different situation. So that would be interesting to also know where the money is going there. And also if you had some data disaggregated between the investment going to government and civil society organization. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that might be around 2 and 3 of the projects. No, I did start off by looking at, where all the money was going. It can get a bit difficult and blurred because we do have, there's regional spending as well. And a lot of the funding, particularly for Pacific Women League and Pacific Women Champion Development, that's, a lot of Australia's funding, and that goes regionally. And so it's a bit harder to disaggregate it in that way. And, I wanted to be able to tell the story, but, that could be stage 2. We'll just have to wait and see. On the first question, the EU is in there. And I think on the Gender 1 projects, we only added an additional 2% in value of their projects. So they are in there. Look, if they're not showing up big results, that's more of a problem of the details that have been recorded and reported by the EU and the story that they're telling as well. And I think, alongside the numbers that we're pulling out from here, the big story is that if the donors can't tell a good story themselves, then it's going to make it very difficult for us to tell that story too.
Okay, for our next questioner, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, panelists. My name is Marilyn Panelist. My question is probably for Jess and Akana. It's about the attention, if any, and collection of data, if any, on the LGBTQIA plus community. Just, if you could speak to that, I'd love to learn if that's being done and how. Thank you.
Oh, I mean, I've just been focusing on women's empowerment in this particular project, and I haven't been looking into financing for that. But again, that could be another project in the future. We have been looking at climate finance as well, and that's going to be, next round of results coming out too.
Thank you. Any other questions before?
I won't ask it of myself. I was just wondering, remittances for women, we know that it's gendered. More women receive remittances than men, and we saw in your research that there's a problem with digital inclusion, financial inclusion, and the digital space is very important. So I'm just wondering, have you sort of come across that with the work that you do and trying to get women into mobile wallets and helping them with the remittances as well?
That was in fact one of the very first work that we did. Closely with the very centralized so we work with the provide some so and various because of this solution that
Thank you very much for that answer. We're almost on time. I want to ask the presenters one thing though, because when I was in that library, I was thinking about like how different the kind of language is that we use around, gender, and yet there seems to be a long way for us to go. The data seems to suggest that there's still problems. There are still challenges around getting support, financial support for gender issues in the digital space, the insurance space. It still seems there was a space to increase women's engagement in those areas very quickly. And we're talking about 45 seconds. If you could just project into the future, what needs to happen now, thinking about the research space or improving gender equity what needs to happen in the future in terms of research, in terms of your work on the ground, or other aspects to help to improve gender equity in the Pacific?
Thanks, Grant. Well, if I'm going to bounce off the research that I've done, the very first thing we need to do is understand what's happening. And then from there, we can, understand the aid effectiveness story, where the money's going, where the money needs to go. It needs to go. So, we know that the problems with gender equality, or inequality rather, right across the Pacific, huge and pervasive and consistent. So, and I think that starts with donor engagement and having a pretty robust database.
Yeah, so I think for me, on top of having more good, robust database, but I think we should get more evidence-based study that's conducted in the Pacific region, so to help us to also identify better intervention, and also more the aid that you provide is also targeted to the right community. So yeah.
Well, with that note, that's a great summary. Thank you. If you could just put your hands together finally, thank our wonderful presenters, and thank you all for attending and your excellent questions. And I understand now that it's lunch, which I'm very excited about. Thank you.